Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Best of the Original Batman, The Caped Crusader's Greatest Adventures. Now, this is a collection of 7 different Batman stories, most of which I believe were published in the 1950s, but this collection was published in 1966, which was the same year that you had the Adam West Batman show, and you could tell this book was definitely published to sort of tie in with that show. Now, I have to say, I had a lot of fun reading the stories in this collection. I'll admit, most of them are pretty cheesy, but comic books in general back in the 50s and 60s were pretty cheesy. Now, the evolution of Batman I do think is pretty interesting. If you look at some of the earlier Batman stories from the late 30s and early 40s, while they are cheesy by today's standards, for the time I could see them being considered to be kind of dark, especially for kids, because in the earlier Batman stories, they really were treated more like detective stories. The detective just happened to be dressed up like a giant bat, but they really were treated like these dark crime stories. In fact, in the first Batman story ever written, The Case of the Chemical Syndicate, that story ends, spoiler alert, where Batman punches the main villain into a vat of acid. But over time, the character became sillier and sillier, and then the Batman stories of the 50s and 60s were goofy as hell, but you could blame that on the Comics Code Authority, because the early 50s is when the Comics Code started up, and that's when comic books really were forced to become much more kid-friendly. I don't know that for sure, but I have a feeling that the goofy-ass Batman of the 50s and 60s kinda came about because of that. And for as much shit as people give the Adam West Batman show, that really was just basing itself off of how silly the comics were at the time. But then by the 70s and early 80s, the comics became a lot darker again and became much more character-driven. But then by the late 80s, you had people like Frank Miller and Alan Moore and Grant Morrison who really did sort of reinvent the character and really sort of led to the darker, more serious Batman that you would see in, like, the first 2 Tim Burton Batman films and, of course, the Christopher Nolan Batman films. But again, this book and the stories within this book were published at a time when Batman comics and comics in general were a lot more lighthearted and a lot more silly. Now, the first story in here is called The Legend of the Batman, Who He Is and How He Came to Be. Now, this one was originally published in 1940 and was written by Bill Finger and illustrated by Bob Kane, both of whom are the original creators of Batman. Now, this one I actually read before because I actually have this story in 2 other Batman collections. I have the story in this collection called Batman the Greatest Stories Ever Told, and I also have it in Batman A Celebration of 75 Years. And this was the first Batman origin story ever written, an origin that Frank Miller, of course, would expand upon decades later. This story explains how Bruce Wayne's parents were murdered by a mugger, and he swore to wage war on all crime, and it explains how over the years he started training, and then one night before he became a vigilante, a bat flew through his window, and that's where he decided that he will dress up as a bat and go out and start fighting crime. Sure, there are some silly aspects to it, but at its heart it is actually a really dark story because this is really the story of a boy who witnesses the murder of his parents. The second story in here is called The Web of Doom, and this one was originally published in, I believe, 1955, but I could be wrong on that, and this story was written by Bill Finger and illustrated by Sheldon Moldoff. This story was actually really freaking good. In fact, I would almost argue that this was the best story in this collection. This story is about this doctor who's suffering from amnesia, and it turns out that prior to this, he tested these microbes on these 3 convicts in jail, but what happens is, he dropped a parcel of these microbes, and now Batman and Robin are trying to get him to figure out where he dropped these so they could find these before this kills a lot of innocent innocent people. So what they gotta do now is they gotta track down these 3 ex-cons and bring them to this doctor to sort of jog his memory. So that's the basic plotline, is Batman and Robin trying to track down these 3 ex-cons, but I thought this was a genuinely pretty good story, and it's actually relatively dark because there are some real stakes here. And in the story, one of these ex-cons is legitimately trying to turn his life around, and there is actually a really good message in here about giving people a second chance. The third story in here is called Fan Mail of Danger, and this was originally published in, I think, 1955 as well, and this was also written by Bill Finger and illustrated by Sheldon Moldoff. And this one is just plain silly. It's a fun story, but it is really silly. Basically, the plot of this story is Batman and Robin are just getting inundated with all this fan mail, which is hindering their war on crime. So they hire a secretary to help them with this fan mail, but she unwittingly increases the volume of the fan mail. And one of these letters asks for Batman's signature, which he gladly gives, but it turns out this letter was actually sent in by a criminal who's trying to figure out Batman's identity by comparing Batman's handwriting to the handwriting of people who have been suspected of being Batman, and Bruce Wayne is on that list. So when Batman and Robin figure this out, they now have to try to stop this criminal. Again, it's a fun but goofy story, and I thought it was hilarious how the secretary in this story clearly wants to bang Batman. They don't actually say that, because keep in mind this was written for kids, and this was written well past the Comics Code Authority, but still, that's clearly what's implied there. The next story in here is called The Crazy Crime Clown, and this one was written by Alvin Schwartz and illustrated by Dick Sprang. But basically the plot of this story is the Joker is going around stealing stuff that he should know has no value, and it seems like the Joker has gone completely insane, which that should have been obvious before, but I understand this was before the Joker was sort of reimagined as a psychotic serial killer. But what happens is the Joker does end up getting locked up in a mental institution, which seems like exactly what he wanted, and Batman and Robin are now trying to figure out what the Joker is up to. But this was a really entertaining story, and I don't want to give away the ending, but the way Batman and Robin best the Joker at the end is freaking hilarious. The next story in here is called The Crime Predictor, and this one was written by Edmund Hamilton and illustrated by Lou Sayer Schwartz. I have no idea if I'm saying the illustrator's name right or not. But the plot of this story is this scientist invents a machine that could actually predict future crimes, and he wants to sell this to the police station, but Batman and Robin are very skeptical of this, but the machine makes a prediction that a villain called Mr. Blank will murder Batman. And Robin is deeply disturbed by this prophecy, and he warns Batman to proceed with caution. But this story I thought was pretty good. I mean, the twist you see coming from a mile away, but it's still a pretty good and fun story. The next story in here is called The Man Who Could Change Fingerprints. Now, I'm actually not sure who wrote this story because this book doesn't actually list the writers of these stories. I found out the writers of most of these stories from looking these stories up online, but the website I looked at doesn't list the name of the author of this story, so I'm not sure who actually wrote this, but I know this was illustrated by Dick Sprang. But the plot of this story is this gangster escapes from jail, and apparently while in jail he figured out the secret to altering your fingerprints, and he goes to this doctor that he knows, and basically him and this doctor are gathering up all these other gangsters and are saying, hey, do these crimes for us, and this doctor will alter your fingerprints. And of course, Batman and Robin are now investigating into this. But this story I thought was really good. Actually, I think this might be my second favorite story in here, next to The Web of Doom. And the final story in here is called The Testing of Batman. And this was another deal where I wasn't able to figure out the name of the writer of this story, but I know the story was illustrated by Dick Sprang. But basically in the story, this doctor approaches Batman and Robin and wants to do a series of psychological and physical tests on them, and Batman and Robin agree, and these gangsters catch wind of this, and basically they hijack this entire operation, and now they're trying to kill Batman and Robin by putting them through this series of tests. This was also a really fun story, and the ending of this story is absolutely hilarious. But yeah, that was my review on the best of the original Batman. I thought the stories in here were a lot of fun. I mean, they're a little goofy, but I still recommend them. I mean, if you're more used to the darker, grittier Batman, these goofier Batman stories that you see in here are definitely going to be a little off-putting for you. But if you're interested in seeing what these comics were like back in the 50s and 60s, then this works as a really good time capsule for that era in comics. Now, you could probably get this book off Amazon. My sister actually got this for me for Christmas. I'm not really sure where she got it from, but if you could get your hands on this book, I would definitely recommend it.